Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more common sense. Today we are diving back into the works of Bertrand Russell. This is In Praise of Idleness and Other Essays. We are reading about the ancestry of fascism. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but some people seem to find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. A particular note again today is almost certainly going to be the Exploring Ideologies, where we talk about exactly why thinking certain things is dumb. With that being said, we are going to dive in and begin this exploration in a slightly unconventional way because we have not done the definitions yet, and so we are going to define it as we come to them. And first up is going to be fascism. Fascism here is defined in two different ways, and this is a good explanation of why Wiki is a good place to start, but not a good place to get all of your information from. On the left-hand side, we have the American Heritage Dictionary, which I have told is racist, which is stupid, but it defines fascism as a system of government marked by centralization of authority under a dictator, a capitalist economy subject to stringent governmental controls, violent suppression of the opposition, and typically a policy of belligerent nationalism and racism, or oppressive dictatorial control. Now, I want to point out one thing that is probably going to step on your toes if you're a fan of Bertrand Russell, but I don't really care. The only difference between this and communism is literally a capitalist economy. It is centralization of under authority by a dictator, which is the exact same as communism and socialism. It is violent suppression of the opposition, which is the exact same under communism and socialism. And it is typically a policy of belligerent nationalism and racism, which is also communism and socialism. So the only difference being the freedom of the market, and because it is centralization under a dictator, it's not really a capitalist market either. It is defined by Wikipedia, which is on the right-hand side of the screen here, as fascism is a far-right authoritarian and ultra-nationalist party, political ideology, and movement, characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy, subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation or race, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. The only difference here between these two definitions being the far right that is added for Wikipedia, and I want you to be fully understanding and comprehending of this. It is only in definition that this differs at all from communism or socialism. They all end up exactly the same way. Strong authoritarian government trying their best to be the central distribution point and failing miserably. We have governments for specific reasons, but those specific reasons are limited to ensuring freedom. If your government is doing anything but ensuring that you have freedom, it is doing the wrong thing. If it is micromanaging supply chains, you are doing the wrong thing. Now, with that being said, and hopefully stepping on toes and running off the communist, let us talk about Bertrand Russell's The Ancestry of Fascism. When we compare our age with that of, say, George I, we are conscious of a profound change of intellectual temper, which has been followed by a corresponding change of the tone of politics. In a certain sense, the outlook of 200 years ago may be called rational, and that which is most characteristic of our time may be called anti-rational. But I want to use these words without implying a complete acceptance of one temper or a complete rejection of the other. Moreover, it is equally important to remember that political events very frequently take their color from the speculations of an earlier time. There is usually a considerable interval between the promulgation of a theory and its practical efficacy. English politics in 1860 were dominated by the ideas expressed by Adam Smith in 1776. German politics today are a realization of theories set forth by Fichte in 1807. Russian politics since 1917 have embodied the doctrines of the Communist Manifesto, which dates from 1848, and we have done in this Exploring Ideologies playlist, it is in there, we have done the Communist Manifesto. To understand the present age, therefore, it is necessary to go back to a considerably earlier time. A widespread political doctrine has, as a rule, two very different kinds of causes. On the one hand, there are the intellectual antecedents, men who have advanced theories which have grown by development or reaction from previous theories. On the other hand, there are economic and political circumstances which predispose people to accept views that minister to certain moods. These alone do not give a complete explanation when, as too often happens, intellectual antecedents are neglected. In the particular case that concerns us, various sections of the post-war world have had certain grounds of discontent which have made them sympathetic to a certain general philosophy invented at a much earlier date. I propose, first, to consider this philosophy and then to touch on the reasons for its present popularity. The revolt against reason began as a revolt against reasoning. In the first half of the 18th century, while Newton ruled men's minds, there was a widespread belief that the road to knowledge consisted in the discovery of simple general laws, from which conclusions could be drawn by deductive rationalization. That word's a little bit ratiocination. It's got to be rationalization, just spelled funny. Many people forgot that Newton's law of gravitation was based upon a century of careful observation and imagined that general laws could be discovered by the light of nature. There was natural religion, natural law, natural morality, and so on. These subjects were supposed to consist of demonstrative inferences from self-evident axioms, after the style of Euclid. The political outcome of this point of view was the doctrine of the rights of man, as preached during the American and French revolutions. But at the very moment when the temple of reason seems to be nearing completion, a mine was laid by which, in the end, the whole edifice was blown sky high. The man who laid the mine was David Hume. His Treatise of Human Nature, published in 1739, has, as its subtitle, an attempt to introduce the experimental methods of reasoning into moral subjects. This represents the whole of his intention, but only half of his performance. His intention was to substitute observation and induction for deduction from nominally self-evident axioms. In his temper of mind, he was a complete rationalist, though of the Baconian rather than the Aristotelian variety. But his almost unexampled combination of acuteness with intellectual honesty led him to certain devastating conclusions. That induction is a habit without logical justification, and that the belief in causation is little better than a superstition. It followed that science, along with theology, should be relegated to the limbo of delusive hopes and irrational convictions. In Hume, rationalism and skepticism existed peacefully side by side. Skepticism was for the study only, and was to be forgotten in the business of practical life. Moreover, practical life was to be governed, as far as possible, by those very methods of science which his skepticism impugned. Such a compromise was only possible for a man who was in equal parts philosopher and a man of the world. There is also a flavor of aristocratic Toryism and the reservation of an esoteric unbelief for the initiated. The world at large refused to accept Hume's doctrines in their entirety. His followers rejected his skepticism, while his German opponents emphasized it as the inevitable outcome of a merely scientific and rational outlook. Thus, as a result of his teaching, British philosophy became superficial, while German philosophy became anti-rational. in each case from fear of an unbearable agnosticism. European thought has never recovered its previous wholeheartedness. Among all the successors of Hume, sanity has meant superficiality, and profundity has meant some degree of madness. In the most recent discussions of the philosophy of appropriate to quantum physics, the old debates raised by Hume are still proceeding. The philosophy, which has been distinctive of Germany, begins with Kant and begins as a reaction against Hume. Kant was determined to believe in causality, God, immortality, the moral law, and so on, but perceived that Hume's philosophy made all this difficult. He therefore invented a distinction between pure reason and practical reason. Pure reason was concerned with what could be proved, which was not much. Practical reason was concerned with what was necessary for virtue, which was a great deal. It is of course obvious that pure reason was simply reason, while practical reason was prejudice. Thus, Kant brought back into philosophy the appeal of something recognized as outside the sphere of theoretical rationality, which had been banished from the schools ever since the rise of scholasticism. More important, even than Kant, from our point of view, was his immediate successor, Fichte, who, passing over from philosophy to politics, inaugurated the movement which has developed into National Socialism. But before speaking of him, there is more to be said about the conception of reason. In view of the failure to find an answer to Hume, reason can no longer be regarded as something absolute, any departure from which it is to be condemned on theoretical grounds. Nevertheless, there is obviously a difference, and an important one, between the frame of mind of, say, the philosophical radicals and such people as the early Mohammedan fanatics. If we call the former temper of mind reasonable and the latter unreasonable, it is clear that there has been a growth of unreason in recent times. I think that what we mean in practice by reason can be defined by three characteristics. In the first place, it relies upon persuasion rather than force. In the second place, it seeks to persuade by means of arguments, which the man who uses them believes to be completely valid. And in the third place, in forming opinions, it uses observation and induction as much as possible, and intuition as little as possible. The first of these rules out of the Inquisition, the second rules out such methods as those of the British war propaganda, which Hitler praises on the ground that propaganda must sink its mental elevation deeper into proportion to the numbers of the mass whom it has to grip. The third forbids the use of such a major promise as that of President Andrew Jackson, a priest of the Mississippi. The God of the universe is this great valley to belong to one nation, intended maybe, which was self-evident to him and his hearers, but not easily demonstrated to one who questioned it. Reliance upon reason, as thus defined, assumes a certain community of interest and outlook between oneself and one's hence. It is true that Mrs. Bond tried it on her ducks when she cried, "Come and be killed, for you must be stuffed and my custom is filled." But in general, the appeal to reason is thought ineffective with those whom we mean to devour. Those who believe in eating meat do not attempt to find arguments which would seem valid to a sheep, and Nietzsche does not attempt to persuade the mass of the population, whom he calls the bungled and the botched. Nor does Marx try to enlist the support of capitalists, as these instances show. The appeal to reason is easier when power is unquestioningly confined to an oligarchy. In 18th century England, only the options of aristocrats and their friends were important, and these could always be presented in a rational form to other aristocrats. As the political constituency grows larger and more heterogeneous, the appeal to reason becomes more difficult, since there are fewer universally conceded assumptions from which agreement can start. When such assumptions cannot be found, Men are driven to rely upon their own intuitions, and, since the intuitions of different groups differ, reliance upon them leads to strife and power politics. Revolts against reason, in this sense, are a recurrent phenomena in history. Early Buddhism was reasonable. Its latter forms, and the Hinduism which replaced it in India, were not. In ancient Greece, the Orphics were in revolt against Homeric rationality. From Socrates to Marcus Aurelius, the prominent men in the ancient world were, in the main, rational. After Marcus Aurelius, even the conservative Neoplatonists were filled with superstition. Except in the Mohammedan world, the claims of reason remained in abeyance until the 11th century. After that, through scholasticism, the Renaissance, and science, they became increasingly dominant. A reaction set in with Rousseau and Wesley, but was held in check by the triumphs of science and machinery in the 19th century. The belief in reason reached its maximum in the 60s. Since then, it has gradually diminished, and it is still diminishing. Rationalism and anti-rationalism have existed side by side since the beginning of Greek civilization, and each, when it has seemed likely to become completely dominant, has always led, by reaction, to a new outburst of its opposite. The modern revolt against reason differs in an important respect from most of its predecessors. From the Orphics onward, the usual aim of the past was salvation, a complex concept involving both goodness and happiness and achieved, as a rule, by some difficult renunciation. The irrationalists of our time aim not at salvation but at power. They thus develop an ethic which is opposed to that of Christianity and of Buddhism, two completely different ethics, even though Christianity is almost certainly derived from Buddhism. And through their trust of domination, they are of necessity involved in politics. If you do not understand what I just said about Christianity being derived from Buddhism, you should check out ISIS Unveiled. I have that in the Esoterica playlist and its own playlist, but you should definitely check that out if you're not clear about that. Their genealogy, among supporters such as Trotsky, Rudyard Kipling, Houston Chamberlain, and Bergson, as opposed to this movement, Benthamites and socialists may be viewed as two wings of one party. Both are cosmopolitan. Both are democratic. Both appeal to economic self-interest. Their differences, inter se, are as to means, not ends. Whereas the new movement, which culminates, as yet, in Hitler, differ from Born, both as to ends, and differs even from the whole tradition of Christian civilization. I could say the exact same thing for socialists. The end which statesmen should pursue, as conceived by almost all the irrationalists out of whom fascism has grown, is most clearly stated by Nietzsche. In conscious opposition to Christianity as well as to the utilitarians, he rejects Bentham's doctrines as regards both happiness and the greatest number. We have dealt in some measure with Nietzsche. If you are unaware, I have a playlist for him as well. Mankind, we did the entirety of Thus Spake Zarathustra. Mankind, he says, is much more of a means than an end. Mankind is merely the experimental material. The end he proposes is the greatness of exceptional individuals. The object is to attain that enormous energy of greatness which can model the man of the future by means of discipline, and also by means of the annihilation of millions of the bungled and botched, and which can yet avoid going to ruin at the sight of the suffering created thereby, the like of which has never been seen before. Nietzsche's conception of the Übermensch, which is what is being talked about here, was you being the best you. That was his conception, you exercising both your body and your mind to the fullest extent possible, of stretching your spirituality beyond the confines of what you were born in, and to become better than those around you. not through governmental means, not through intervention and force or even destroying people, but by being the best and therefore setting the example for better to come later. That was Nietzsche's Übermensch. It was not, we're going to take control of genetics and kill people. That was not what he was talking about. And if you don't understand that, see the playlist on Thus Spake Zarathustra, where we talk about that in some detail. This conception of the end, it should be observed, cannot be regarded as in itself contrary to reason, since questions of ends are not amenable to rational argument. We may dislike it, I do myself, but we cannot disprove it any more than Nietzsche can prove it. There is, nonetheless, a natural connection with irrationality, since reason demands impartiality, whereas the cult of the great man always has its minor premise, the assertion, I am a great man. The founders of the school of thought out of which fascism has grown all have certain common characteristics. They seek the good in will rather than in feeling or cognition. They value power more than happiness. They prefer force to argument, war to peace, aristocracy to democracy, propaganda to scientific impartiality. They advocate a Spartan form of austerity as opposed to the Christian form. That is to say, they view austerity as a means to obtaining mastery over others, not as a self-discipline which helps to produce virtue, and happiness only in the next world. That is not necessarily the Spartan way of life. Like, Spartan was very much interested in producing the best warriors, but that was on a personal level, right? You were expected to perform with excellence, right? You were meant to exercise both your body and your mind. The later ones among them are imbued with popular Darwinism and regard the struggle for existence as the source of the higher species. But it is to be rather a struggle between races than one between individuals, such as the apostles of free competition advocated. Pleasure and knowledge, conceived as ends, appear to them unduly passive. For pleasure they substitute glory, and for knowledge the pragmatic assertion that what they desire is true. In Fichte, Carlyle, and Manzini, these doctrines are still enveloped in a manner of conventional moralistic cant. In Nietzsche, they first step forth naked and unashamed. Fichte has received less than his due share of credit for inaugurating this great movement. He began as an abstract metaphysician, but showed even then a certain arbitrary and self-centered disposition. Pot, meat, kettle. Like literally pot, meat, kettle. Have you met him, Mr. Russell? Like, his whole philosophy develops out of the proposition, I am I, to which he says, the ego posits itself, and it is in consequence of this bare positing by itself. It is both the agent and the result of the action, the active, and that which is produced by the activity. I am expresses a deed, Handlung. The ego is because it is posited itself. The ego, according to this theory, exists because it wills to exist. Yeah, kinda. Presently, it appears that the non-ego also exists because the ego so wills it. But a non-ego so generated never becomes really external to the ego, which chooses to posit it. Louis XIV said, "L'état c'est moi." Fichte said, "The universe is myself." As Heine remarked in comparing Kant and Robespierre, in comparison with us Germans, you French are tame and moderate. Fichte, it is true, explains, after a while, that when he says I, he means God, but the reader is not wholly reassured. When, as a result of the Battle of Jena, Fichte had to fly from Berlin, he began to think that he had been too vigorously positing the non-ego in the shape of Napoleon. On his return in 1807, he delivered his famous Addresses to the German Nation, in which, for the first time, the complete creed of nationalism was set out. These addresses began by explaining that the German is superior to all other moderns, because he alone has a pure language. That's hilarious. The Russians, Turks, and Chinese, not to mention the Eskimos and Hottentots, also have pure languages, but they were not mentioned in Fichte's history books. The purity of the German language makes the German alone capable of profundity. He concludes that to have character and to be German undoubtedly mean the same. But if the German character is to be preserved from foreign corrupting influences, and if the German nation is to be capable of acting as a whole, there must be a new kind of education which will mold the Germans into a corporate body. This new education, he says, must consist essentially in this, that it completely destroys freedom of the will. He adds that will is the very root of man. There is to be no external commerce beyond what is absolutely unavoidable. There is to be universal military service. Everybody is to be compelled to fight, not for material well-being, not for freedom, not in defense of the Constitution, but under the impulsion of the devouring flame of higher patriotism, which embraces the nation as the vesture of the eternal, for which the noble-minded man joyfully sacrifices himself, and the ignoble man, who exists only for the sake of the other, must likewise sacrifice himself. This doctrine, that the noble man is the purpose of humanity, and that the ignoble man has no claims of his own account, is of the essence of the modern attack on democracy. Christianity taught that every human being has an immortal soul, and that, in this respect, all men are equal. The rights of man was only a development of Christian doctrine. No, utilitarianism, while it conceded no absolute rights to the individual, gave the same weight to one man's happiness as to another's. Thus, it led to democracy just as much as did the doctrine of natural rights. But Fichte, like a sort of political Calvin, picked out certain men as the elect and rejected all the rest as of no account. It is important to note exactly what democracy is, right? Democracy is everybody gets a vote, everybody gets counted, and they are all equally weighted, which sounds like a wonderful thing until you take into account that it is mob rule, right? And people are in general stupid. They believe wild things. They go off in various tangents. That is why we here in the United States do not have a democracy. We use democratic systems, and that is not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. That means that the Constitution is the rule of law, and we, as a republic, a amalgamation of individual states, choose to use that Constitution as the basis for all of our decisions. In short, in a democracy, if there are three of us and I own something, and you and the other guy decide that y'all want my something, you can take it. In a democratic republic, if you two decide that you want to take it, that's too bad. The law protects it. That is the difference between a constitutional republic, which we are, and a democracy, which we are not. Democracy is being held up as an ideal here, and it is not. Everybody should have a say. I agree with that. But that should be in the formation of our laws. It should have a process somewhat extended in order to ensure that we are following something. Right? That is why we have the Constitution. The difficulty, of course, is to know who are the elect. In a world in which Fichte's doctrine was universally accepted, every man would think that he was noble, and would join some party of people sufficiently similar to himself to seem to share some of his nobility. These people might be his nation, as in Fichte's case, or his class, as in that of a proletarian communist, or his family, as with Napoleon. There is no objective criterion of nobility except success in war. Therefore, war is the necessary outcome of this creed. Carlyle's outlook on life was, in the main, derived from Fichte, who was the strongest single influence on his opinions, but Carlyle added something which has been characteristic of the school ever since: a kind of socialism and solicitude for the proletariat, which is really dislike of industrialism and of the nouveau riche. Carlyle did this so well that he deceived even Engels, whose book on the English working class in 1844 mentions him with the highest praise. In view of this, we can scarcely wonder that many people were taken in by the socialistic facade in National Socialism. And again, the only difference between socialism and fascism is the application. I mean, it's literally the same thing with slightly different end goals. Not even real different, but slightly. Carlyle, in fact, still has his dupes. His hero worship sounds very exalted. We need, he says, not elected parliaments, but hero kings, and a whole world not unheroic. To understand this, one must study its translation into fact. Carlyle, in Past and Present, holds up the 12th century Abbot Samson as a model. But whoever does not take that worthy on trust, but reads the Chronicle of Jocelyn of Brakeland, will find that the abbot was an unscrupulous ruffian, combining the vices of a tyrannous landlord with those of a pettifogging attorney. Carlyle's other heroes are at least equally objectionable. Cromwell's massacres in Ireland move him to the comment, "But in Oliver's time, as I say, there was still belief in the judgment of God. In Oliver's time there was yet no distracted jargon of abolishing capital punishments, of Jean-Jacques philanthropy, and universal rose-water in this world still so full of sin. Only in late decadent generations can such indiscriminate mashing up of good and evil into one universal patriarchal take effect on our earth." Of most of his other heroes, such as Frederick the Great, Dr. Francia, and Governor Eyre, all that need to be said is that their one common characteristic was a thirst for blood. Those who still think that Carlyle was in some sense more or less liberal should read his chapter on democracy in Past and Present. Most of it is occupied with praise of William the Conqueror and with a description of the pleasant lives enjoyed by serfs in his day. Then comes a definition of liberty. The true liberty of a man, you would say, consisted in his finding out, or being forced to find out, the right path and walk thereon. Page 263. He passes on to the statement that democracy means despair of finding any heroes to govern you, and contented putting up with the want of them. It is not untrue. The chapter ends by stating, in eloquent prophetical language, that when democracy shall have run its full course, the problem that will remain is that of finding government by your real superiors. Is there one word in all of this to which Hitler would not subscribe? You know who else drank water? Hitler. That is really a problem. That is really a problem. We have a constitutional republic, but we have democratic systems, and that is a real problem. We have a Supreme Court justice that cannot define what a woman is. We have several legislators creating law which have no concept of reality, along the same way as the judicial representative. And so we have a government made up of popular people. We do not have a government made up by people who are real superiors. And if you are unaware, there are such people, right? The intellectual equivalency, or the intellectual quotient, the IQ, is a real thing, even if it is not implemented in the correct manner. Some people do not have the capacity to think. Fully 40%, I think, of people operate on a subpar level of operation, and par being the median, so I understand it should be 50. It's not quite. Most people are in the middle of the range, and they have fairly good cognition. Some people are exceptional. They have a greater than normal understanding of things on an intuitional level and are able to relay that instantly, right? They are real superiors. The people who can take a concept and entertain it without absorbing it completely, automatically, those are real superiors. They can formulate and pick through and do things which make them superior to people on the lesser end. That doesn't mean that they're intrinsically worth more, but in the realm of government, they have a better understanding. Those should be the people that we elect, but we don't. Because we rely way too heavily upon the democratic systems as opposed to personal responsibility, we allow the popular person to get in there. Whoever spends the most money on campaigns is probably who's going to be elected. And that does not make them superior, right? I want somebody who is my mental superior making the decisions. I don't want somebody who can barely understand the concept, don't eat crayons, to be making decisions. I don't want that. I want somebody who is smarter than me making the choices, right? And I put myself on the mid-level. I'm not on the upper end of that spectrum. I'm definitely not on the lower end, but I'm on the higher end of the mid-level, right? I have more cognition than a lot of people. That is just simply fact. It is not me being heady, right? It is not me with my ego saying, "Oh, this is me," right? I take the time to rationalize. I look at the things behind it. I get all of the information I can, and then I formulate an opinion from that. And that, all of that, is more of a step than most people make. So I'm on the higher end. But there are definitely concepts that are beyond me. I'm not a physicist, right? I'm not even an engineer, although I do understand both of those on a very base level, right? And so I am not a superior. I would like to see the superior in office. And not because they were born from a certain family. That doesn't make you superior. There is no chosen people. There is no bloodline of superiority. There are practices which make you superior. And sometimes there are genetics that make you superior. That does not mean that only the superior should reproduce or that we should even guide along those lines. That is not what I am saying. All right, back to the text. Manzini was a milder man than Carlyle, from whom he disagreed as regards the cult of heroes. Not the individual great man, but the nation was the subject of his adoration, and while he placed Italy highest, he allowed a role to every European nation except the Irish. And see, this is what I was just talking about. No, there is no chosen people. You are not chosen because you are German. You are not chosen because you are Jewish. You are not a chosen people. There can be a chosen person. There will never be a chosen people. He believed, however, like Carlyle, that duty should be placed above happiness, even above even collective happiness. He thought that God revealed to each human conscience what was right, and that all that was necessary was that everybody should obey the moral law as felt in his own heart. That is not entirely incorrect. The problem being that some people have not sought correct moral law. They live where they were born, and so they perpetuate things that are untrue. Racism, for instance. So if you are raised up and steeped in racism, then your morals are not going to be the same as somebody who was not. That is what I'm saying here. And so we should all strive for the highest point, right? In your body, in your mind, and everything that you do, you should be seeking to be the best that you can. Absolutely. And all that is really necessary is for people to have the knowledge and then act upon that. He never realized that different people may genuinely differ as to what the moral law enjoins, or that he was really demanding was that others should act according to his revelation. That's basically what I just said. He put morals above democracy, saying, "The simple vote of a majority does not constitute sovereignty if it evidently contradicts the supreme moral precepts." That's why we have a constitution. That's why I took the time to point out the fact that we are a constitutional republic and not a democracy, because that is true, right? The vote of a majority does not constitute sovereignty if it evidently contradicts the supreme moral precepts. And I'm going to give you one of them hot touch points that you can just take and stick it wherever you want. Abortion. It is the murder of a life. It is killing a child. There may be extenuating circumstances which make that acceptable. I'll grant that, right? Incest, things along that nature, violence, things along that nature, may be exculpatory. But overall, by and large, it is murder. We have majorities in states who are perfectly fine with that. That doesn't mean that they're morally correct, right? That is what this is talking about. That is the statement that he is saying about a simple vote of a majority does not constitute sovereignty, even if it evidently contradicts with the supreme moral precepts. To take this to the extreme, right? Not only is it okay for you to commit the murder, but we are going to force you to because of our laws. And in a democracy, that can happen, right? We are protected in individual sovereignty by the Constitution. If not for that rule of law, the majority could say, we don't want your child, and they could take it from you. That is what the democracy brings. That is why we use democratic procedures, but we are not a democracy. The will of the people is sacred when it interprets and applies the moral law, null and impotent when it disassociates itself from the law and only represents caprice. This is also the opinion of Mussolini. You know who else drinks water? Mussolini. Only one important element has since been added to the doctrines of this school, namely the pseudo-Darwinian belief in race. Fichte made German superiority a matter of language, not of biological heredity. Nietzsche, who, unlike his followers, is not a nationalist or an anti-Semite, true, applies the doctrine only as between different individuals, true. He wishes the unfit to be prevented from breeding, and he hopes, by the methods of the dog fancier, to produce a race of upper supermen who shall have all power, and for whose benefit alone the rest of mankind shall exist. And, as I explained earlier, this is somewhat a misinterpretation and a misrepresentation of what Nietzsche actually said. Much in the way that when he says, God is dead and we killed him, and it is a lamentable effect, that is a mangling of the quote, but that's the basis of the quote. People only take the first part of that, God is dead, and they run with it. That is not what he said. He said, we have killed the concept of God, and because we have killed the concept of God, we have taken upon ourselves a whole lot of moral problems. He said that you should strive to be the best that you can be, and women should strive to be the best that they can be, and because of that, they should not accept a lesser mate. That is how you bring about the Übermensch. I could be wrong, right? It has been a couple of months since we went through the Nietzsche study, and there were definitely parts in there that I did not agree with at all. You can go back and watch it. But for the most part, I want to make sure that the man is not misrepresented, right? He was not talking about genetic manipulation in the way that is given, right? People say that he was linked to Hitler and that Hitler took his stuff, and that's not really true, right? In part it is, but Hitler took what he said and did something different. And he took the concept of the Übermensch and made it a let's burn all the Jews, which is not what was intended at all. Back to the text. But subsequent writers with a similar outlook have tried to prove that excellence has been connected with their own race. And let me go ahead and make this abundantly clear too. To me, there is only one race, the human race. We all have the exact same fundamental characteristics. We have fingers, we have toes, we have a torso with a heart in the center, a little bit to the left. We have 2 lungs, right? These are generalizations. Some people are born without a lung. I understand that. There are exceptions to every rule. But for the most part, we all bleed red. We all have tissue, and if you strip off the skin, if you are laying there, you can make some observable differentiation between the skeletons of an ethnically white person and an ethnically not white person, right? Just to keep it broad. But those are explainable by circumstances of climate. They are not genetic deviations. You can interbreed with any race on the planet. And all that is going to be is a different shade. I have melanin, right? I am mostly white, if you're unaware, right? I am Irish, I am Cajun, and I am Native American. I am mostly white, however, and I don't claim to be some Indian guru or something of that nature, like, Elizabeth Warren and all that shit. I do have the blood in me, though. I am a full-on mutt. And so, for me to say that somebody else's race makes them lesser than me is fucking stupid. I was raised that way, right? I literally came up that white people were better than everybody else. It is through the direct revelation of God and being able to rationalize that I have come past that. God created me and you, both of us, with equality, perfectly. That doesn't mean that we are equally capable in all of the same areas, but you have your strengths, I have my strengths, but we are both equal in our opinions. We are both equal in our desires, right? My desires do not supersede yours. Yours do not supersede me. There is only differentiation in race due to climatic necessity. The fact that my melanin levels are different from your melanin levels have absolutely nothing to do with who I am intrinsically. Back to the text. Irish professors wrote books to prove that Homer was an Irishman. Sorry. French anthropologists gave archaeological evidence that the Celts, not the Teutons, were the source of civilization in Northern Europe. Houston Chamberlain argues at length that Dante was a German and Christ was not a Jew. Emphasis upon race has been universal among Anglo-Indians, from whom imperialist England caught the infection through the medium of Rudyard Kipling. But the anti-Semitic element has never been prominent in England, although an Englishman, Houston Chamberlain, was mainly responsible for giving it a sham historical basis in Germany, where it had persisted ever since the Middle Ages. About race, if politics were not involved, it would be enough to say that nothing politically important is known. It may be taken as probable that there are genetic mental differences between the races. No, but it is certain that we do not yet know what these differences are in an adult man. The effect of environment masks those of heredity. There is nothing intrinsically lesser in any other melanin level's intelligence. But just as the same way as we talked about the greater man earlier and the scale upon which humanity is, right? You have people that cannot cognize at all, right? You have people who are almost to the cognitive level, such as Down syndrome, for instance. And that is no hate towards Downs. They do things, but they are lesser in cognition. They don't understand certain concepts, right? There is a sliding scale. But it is a sliding scale for all of humanity, not just any particular race. Moreover, the racial differences among different Europeans are less definite than those between white, yellow, and black men. There are no well-marked physical characteristics by which members of different modern European nations can be certainly known apart. Since all have resulted from a mixture of different stocks. When it comes to mental superiority, every civilized nation can make out a plausible claim, which proves that all the claims are equally invalid. It is possible that the Jews are inferior to the Germans, but it is just as possible that the Germans are inferior to the Jews. Neither one of them are inferior to the other one. The whole business of introducing pseudo-Darwinian jargon in such a question is utterly unscientific. Whatever we may come to know hereafter, we have not at present any good ground for wishing to encourage one race at the expense of another, and I agree with that. The whole movement, from Fichte onwards, is a method of bolstering up self-esteem and lust for power by means of beliefs which have nothing in their favor except that which they are flattering. Fichte needed a doctrine upon which he could make him feel superior to Napoleon. Carlyle and Nietzsche had infirmities for which they sought compensation in the world of imagination. British imperialism of Richard Kipling's epoch was due to shame at having lost industrial supremacy. And I don't know what that is. It might be illiterate. Kind of looks like illiterate, but I'm not sure. And the illiterate madness of our time is a mantle of myth upon which the German ego keeps himself warm against the cold blast of Versailles. No man thinks sanely when his self-esteem has suffered a mortal wound, and those who deliberately humiliate a nation have only themselves to thank if it becomes a nation of lunatics. This brings me to the reasons which have produced the wide acceptance of the irrational and even anti-rational doctrine that we have been considering. There are, at most times, all sorts of doctrines being preached by all sorts of prophets, but those which become popular must make some special appeal to the mood produced by the circumstances of the time. Now the characteristic doctrines of modern irrationalists, as we have seen, are emphasis on will as opposed to thought and feeling, glorification of power, belief in institutional positing, of propositions as opposed to observational and inductive testing. This state of mind is the natural reaction of those who have the habit of controlling modern mechanisms such as aeroplanes, and also of those who have less power than formerly but are unable to find any rational ground for the restoration of their former preponderance. Industrialism and the war, while giving the habit of mechanical power, caused a great shift of economic and political power, and therefore left large groups in the mood for pragmatic self-assertion. Hence, the growth of fascism and communism and socialism. Comparing the world of 1920 with that of 1820, we find that there had been an increase of power on the part of large industrialists, wage earners, women, heretics, and Jews. By heretics, I mean those whose religion was not that of the government of their country. Correlatively, there have been a loss of power on the parts of monarchs, aristocracies, ecclesiastics, and the lower middle classes, and males as opposed to females. The large industrialists, though stronger than at any previous period, felt themselves insecure owing to the threat of socialism, and, more particularly, from fear of Moscow. The war interests, generals, admirals, aviators, and armament firms, were in the like case strong at the moment, but menaced by a pestilential crew of Bolsheviks and pacifists. The sections, already defeated, the kings and the nobles, the small shopkeepers, the men from temperament, were opponents of a religious toleration. And the men who regretted the days of masculine domination over women seemed to be definitely down and out. Economic and cultural developments, it was thought, had left no place for them in the modern world. Naturally, they were discontented, and collectively, they were numerous. The Nietzschean philosophy was psychologically adapted to their mental needs, and, very cleverly, the industrialist and militarist made use of it to weld the defeated sections into a party, which would support a medievalist reaction in everything except industry and war. In regard to industry and war, there was to be everything modern in the way of technique, but not sharing out of the power and the dangerous and the effort after peace that made socialists dangerous to the existing magnates. Thus, the irrational elements in the Nazi philosophy are due, politically speaking, to the need of enlisting the support of sections which have no longer any raison d'être, while comparatively sane elements are due to the industrialist and militarist. The former elements are irrational because it is scarcely possible that the small shopkeepers, for example, should realize their hopes, and fantastic beliefs are their only refuge from despair. And I'm going to disagree here. Small shopkeepers absolutely are the key to economic freedom, right? I am not a proponent of Walmart. I hate that place. There are things that I can only get there or from Amazon, so I go to Walmart because at least they employ local people. But if I can get it from a local store, I will, because local small shopkeepers are the key to economic success. Walmart is a destructive force. It is price control and centralization epitomized, right? It has led to the destruction of this country in very real ways, which I can expound upon. If you are interested, let me know and I will do my rant on Walmart. But small shopkeepers are the key, and they still today, even with Walmart and Amazon and all of that, they still exist and realize their hopes. Maybe not if their hopes are to become Walmart or Amazon, but if their hopes are to provide a great life for themselves and their family, they do that every day. If it is to acquire property, they do that every day. If it is to have a measure of economic success, they do that every day. So, differentiation. Back to the text. Per contra, the hopes of industrialists and militarists might be realized by means of fascism, but hardly in any other way. The fact that their hopes cannot be achieved through the ruin of civilization does not make them irrational, but only satanic. It is absolutely fucking hilarious that he uses this word in this book, right? If you were unaware, he went from Presbyterian, I believe, maybe Episcopalian, something, one of those not quite Catholic religions, into atheism, and then into agnosticism. So he didn't believe in Satan. These men form I don't either, right? I don't believe that Satan is a real thing. These men form intellectually the best and morally the worst element in the movement. The rest, dazzled by the vision of glory, heroism, and self-sacrifice, have become blind to their serious interest, and in a blaze of emotion have allowed themselves to be used for purposes not their own. This is the psychopathology of Nazism. I have spoken of the industrialists and militarists who support fascism as sane, but their sanity is only comparative. Thyssen believes that by means of the Nazi movement he can kill both socialism and immensely increase his market. Not going to happen, because socialism and fascism are literally the same thing with a slightly different definition to make them seem different. There seems, however, no more reason to think him right than there was to think that his predecessors were right in 1914. It is necessary for him to stir up German self-confidence and nationalist feeling to a dangerous degree, and unsuccessful war is the most probable outcome. Even great initial successes would not bring ultimate victory. Now, as 20 years ago, the German government forgets America. There is one very important element which is on the whole against the Nazis, although it might have been expected to support reaction. I mean, organized religion. The philosophy of the movement which culminates in the Nazis is, in a sense, a logical development of Protestantism. The morality of Fichte and Carlyle is Calvinistic. That's not much morality at all. And Mazzini, who was in lifelong opposition to Rome, had a thoroughly Lutheran belief in the infallibility of the individual conscience. Nietzsche believed passionately in the worth of the individual and considered that the hero should not submit to authority. In this, he was developing the Protestant spirit of revolt. It might have been expected that the Protestant churches would welcome the Nazi movement, and to a certain extent they did so. But in all those elements which Protestantism shared with Catholicism, it found itself opposed by the new philosophy. Nietzsche is emphatically anti-Christian, and Houston Chamberlain gives an impression that Christianity was a degraded superstition that grew up among the mongrel cosmopolitans of the Levant. That is not entirely untrue. Again, see Isis Unveiled. The rejection of humility, of love of one's neighbor, and of the rights of the meek is contrary to the gospel teaching, and anti-Semitism, when it is theoretical as well as practical, is not easily reconciled with a religion of Jewish origin. For these reasons, Nazism and Christianity have difficulty in making friends, and it is not impossible that their antagonism may bring about the downfall of the Nazis. I'm not sure exactly when this was done, right? The last one, or the one before it, was in the 30s after Hitler. This appears to be in the middle of, right? So we're not following chronological order, possibly. I don't know. I did not research that. There is another reason why the modern cult of unreason, whether in Germany or elsewhere, is incompatible with any traditional form of Christianity. Inspired by Judaism, Christianity adopted the notion of truth with the correlative virtue of faith. I don't know that that's correlative. The notion and virtue survived in honest doubt, as all the Christian virtues remained among Victorian free thinkers. But gradually, the influence of skepticism and advertising made it seem hopeless to discover truth, but very profitable to assert falsehood. Intellectual probity was thus destroyed. Hitler, explaining the Nazi program, says, "The national state will look upon science as a means for increasing national pride. Not only world history, but also the history of civilization must be taught from this point of view. The inventor should appear great, not merely as an inventor, but even more so as a fellow countryman. Admiration of any great deed must be combined with pride, because the fortunate doer of it is a member of our own nation. We must extract the greatest from the mass of great names in German history, and place them before the youth in so impressive a fashion that they may become the pillars of an unshakable nationalist sentiment." Sorry, I got a piece of thyme on my tonsil. Ooh. The conception of science as a pursuit of truth has so entirely disappeared from Hitler's mind that he does not even argue against it. As we know, the theory of relativity has come to be thought bad because it was invented by a Jew. The Inquisition rejected Galileo's doctrine because it considered it untrue. But Hitler accepts or rejects doctrines on political grounds without bringing in the notion of truth or falsehood. Poor William James, who invented this point of view, would be horrified at the use which is made of it. But when once the conception of objective truth is abandoned, it is clear that the question, "What shall I believe?" is one to be settled. As I wrote in 1907, by the appeal to force and the arbitrament of big battalions, not by the methods of either theology or science, states whose policy is based upon the revolt against reason must therefore find themselves in conflict, not only with learning, but also with the churches, wherever any genuine Christianity survives. An important element in the causation of the revolt against reason is that many able and energetic men have no outlet for their love of power and therefore become subversive. Small states, formerly, gave more men political power, and small businesses gave more men economic power. Consider the huge population that sleeps in suburbs and works in great cities. Coming into London by train, one passes through great regions of small villas, inhabited by families which feel no solidarity with the working class. The man of the family has no part in local affairs, since he is absent all day submitting to the orders of his employers. His only outlet for initiative is the cultivation of his back garden at the weekend. Politically, he is envious of all that is done for the working classes, but, though he feels poor, snobbery prevents him from adopting the methods of socialism and trade unionism. His suburb may be as populous as many a famous city of antiquity, but its collective life is languid, and he has no time to be interested in it. To such a man, if he has enough spirit for discontent, a fascist movement may well appear as a deliverance. That is the straw man that he built. The decay of reason in politics is a product of two factors. On the one hand, there are classes and types of individuals to whom the world, as it is, offers no scope, but who see no hope in socialism because they are not wage earners. On the other hand, there are able and powerful men whose interests are opposed to those of the community at large, and who, therefore, can best retain their influence by promoting various kinds of hysteria. Anti-communism, fear of foreign armaments, and hatred of foreign competition are the most important bogeys. All true, right? That is the problem. That is one of the problems, right? The assumption that you are going to get rid of foreign armaments because you get rid of yours is fucking dumb. A hatred of foreign competition promotes you doing better, right? The reason why the United States is in such dire straits is because we got rid of that. Because we got rid of the hatred of foreign competition. There was a time in this country where buying American meant something. It was going to be better produced and cheaper. And now it's not so, because we ship our means of production to a communist nation which literally uses slavery, and therefore have artificially subdued the prices. So they have better competition. That is because we got rid of our hatred of foreign competition. If we would have kept our manufacturing, everybody in this country would be better off than they are now. Back to the text. I do not mean that no rational man could feel these sentiments. I mean that they are used in a way to preclude intelligent consideration of practical issues. The two things the world needs most are socialism and peace. Wrong. But both are contrary to the interests of the most powerful men of our time. It is not difficult to make the steps leading up to them appear contrary to the interest of large sections of the population, and the easiest way of doing this is to generate mass hysteria. The greater the danger of socialism and peace, the more governments will debauch the mental life of their subjects, and the greater the economic hardships of the present, the more willing the sufferers will be to be seduced from intellectual sobriety in favor of some delusive will-o'-the-wisp. Sir, once again, meet the fucking kettle. We will be dealing with socialism in extreme detail when we get to that essay. So I am not going to break down any more than I already have how absolutely fallacious this is. The fever of nationalism, which has been increasing ever since 1848, is one form of the cult of unreason. The idea of one universal truth has been abandoned. There is English truth, French truth, German truth, Montenegrin truth, and truth for the Principality of Monaco. Similarly, there is truth for the wage earner and truth for the capitalist. Between these different truths, if rational persuasion is despaired of, the only possible decision is by means of war and rivalry and propagandist insanity. Until the deep conflicts of nations and classes which infect our world have been resolved, it is hardly to be expected that mankind will return to a rational habit of mind. The difficulty is that, so long as unreason prevails, a solution for our troubles can only be reached by chance. For while reason, being impersonal, makes universal cooperation possible, unreason, since it represents private passions, makes strife inevitable. It is for this reason that rationality, in the sense of an appeal to the universal and impersonal standard of truth, is of supreme importance to the well-being of the human species, not only in ages in which it easily prevails, but also, and even more, in those less fortunate times in which it is despised and rejected as the vain dream of men who lack the virility to kill where they cannot agree. And that is going to bring us to the end of the history of fascism, or the ancestry of fascism, or whatever it's called. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but I do not apologize for it. If you are anticipating my argument against socialism, I refer you to this playlist, right? The Exploring Ideologies playlist, where we went through the Communist Manifesto. And I made the exact same arguments that I made against socialism there. The only difference between socialism and communism is literally who is supposed to be in charge at the end, right? Socialism is taking the means of production for the government, using central planning to distribute the things according to needs. Communism is that exact same thing, but instead of it being centralized in the government, it is supposed to be delegated to a informed, responsible party representative who is an individual dispersed. So as opposed to the state being the entity in charge in socialism, it is I forget what term he uses, but it is the people who fomented the revolution who are in charge. So it is dispersed authority, supposed to be. In actuality, it shakes out to be exactly the same, right? Communism resulted in Khrushchev, right, taking complete control, right? It's Mao Zedong taking complete control. It's Kim Jong-un taking complete control, right? It is supposed to be diversified. There is not supposed to be the one leader in charge of communism. And if there is one leader who is making all of these decisions, it's socialism. That's literally the only difference. And so if you want an extreme elucidation on that, the Communist Manifesto, I think I got 3 or 4 videos out of that, because we talked about it in some measure of degree. We'll probably do the same with socialism whenever it comes up. It's only like 1 or 2 essays away, so we're going to get there relatively soon. But if you're anticipating, check it out. It's there. We talk about all of the same things for the same reasons, right? All of these are great on paper. On paper, communism is the best system of government. It really is. The problem is humanity. We desire power. And by we, I don't include myself. I don't really care for power. But as a species, we do. We set ourselves in hierarchies. We degrade those we consider less than. We adore those we consider more than, as a human species. That is the problem with communism. It's great on paper, but it doesn't work out in practicality. The same with socialism, even to a certain degree with fascism. Fascism, as defined, is a little bit different from communism and socialism, but not really. It's pretty close to the same animal. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that I said here. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you have another work you would like to see me discuss in the manner that we are doing here, drop that in the comments as well. And if you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks, because I am not a communist and the bills do not pay themselves. To the crew,
thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take.
Peace.